Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What do soybeans, America's drug addiction woes, and electric cars have in common? Let's get to the bottom line. If you answered China, you're right. For the United States, China is just a linchpin that can't be avoided. And that's why the meeting between the leaders of both countries was so crucial. American farmers were hit hard when China stopped importing soybeans earlier this year, after President Donald Trump launched tariff broadsides against the entire world. And China has the market cornered on rare earth minerals, the stuff that goes into everything from light bulbs to camera lenses and batteries for electric vehicles, not to mention sophisticated military weapons. Plus, Washington accuses Beijing of not cracking down enough on suppliers sending fentanyl precursors to the United States. That drug alone killed about 130 Americans per day last year. Trump says his meeting with China's President Xi Jinping was, quote, amazing, but China's officials have been more subdued. So what's been achieved, and who's up and who's down? Today we're talking with Evan Medeiros, professor of Asia Studies at Georgetown University, and he's former U.S. National Security Council director for China during the Obama administration. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. Look, there was this big meeting in South Korea, Busan, South Korea, with President Xi and Donald Trump getting together. We don't know all of the outlines of a deal, other than that both sides are saying some sort of deal had been reached. So I'd like to get your take on this moment and whether it's a significant punctuation point in the relationship, or is this going to be, you know, an ongoing up and down, continually tested deal between the United States and China?
Thanks, Steve. Great questions and really great to be here. Thanks for having me on. So the way I think about this deal is it's somewhere between a ceasefire and a truce in the U.S.-China trade war. So ceasefire and truce. And the reason I say that is because what was agreed was actually pretty limited and pretty narrow. For example, both sides agreed to pause for a year their major export control actions. So that's Commerce Department actions on the U.S. side, the rare earth actions on the Chinese side. The U.S. also agreed to reduce by 10% some of its tariffs on China. The Chinese, in exchange, agreed to buy more soybeans, and according to the U.S. side, also to buy more oil and gas. Perhaps most significantly, both sides agreed that Trump would travel to China for a state visit in April of next year, and then Xi Jinping would reciprocate, presumably to attend the G20, which the U.S. is hosting next year as well. So again, we have a pretty limited, narrow deal. It's essentially focused on de-escalating, but none of the big structural challenges, contradictions, problems in the U.S.-China relationship were addressed. So in many ways, this sort of takes us back to essentially the beginning of the Trump administration. Going forward, one key thing to watch is whether or not the Trump administration agrees to sell some of the high-capacity NVIDIA chips to China. We know the Chinese are interested in them. It was somewhat of it was discussed during the meeting, but nothing was resolved. So that's definitely a key watch point going forward.
What do you think about the Russia-China dimensions of this? Did China in any way decide it was going to buy less, oil and energy from Russia? Were there any constraints? Because that's been another part of Donald Trump's diplomacy with countries like India and others saying, hey, you've got to stop fueling the Russia engine to be on our good side.
Yeah, it's a great point. So while this narrow limited deal was largely about commercial issues, apparently there was also conversation about one big geopolitical issue, and that is Chinese support for Russia. And according to the Trump team, Trump really pressed Xi Jinping to pull back on Chinese support for Russia. In particular, Chinese very substantial purchases of Russian oil, which of course keeps the Russian economy afloat and the war machine going forward. There were no agreements reached on it. And the reality is what we know about Xi Jinping's views and China's views is that they're really not going to budge. I mean, Xi Jinping is absolutely positively committed to ensuring that Russia doesn't lose. In fact, in a recent meeting between Xi Jinping's top diplomat, Wang Yi, and the top EU diplomat, I mean, Wang Yi apparently told them, we are committed to ensuring that Russia doesn't lose. That is bad for China geopolitically. So while that issue is discussed, um, I have very low expectations that there'll be any movement on China's support for Russia.
Evan, I'd like our audience to understand a little bit about the stakes of this, this race, this competition. When Xi Jinping basically began to choke down rare earth exports to the United States, the market really reacted to that. I don't think many people, unless you're in the business, know what rare earths are. It's sort of a term that people don't understand the significance of it. They may not understand, how dependent we are on Chinese rare earths, on Chinese magnets here in the United States. So can you describe why these elements are so geostrategically significant?
Steve, it's a very important point because the funny thing about rare earths is they're not actually that rare. It just happens to be that they tend to exist in very, very small quantities, and it takes an enormous amount of processing, which is very, very environmentally dirty, to actually extract these rare earths from from um, uh, other minerals. And so the reason rare earths has become such a big deal is because the Chinese control basically somewhere between 70 to 90% of the global market in mining and processing of rare earths. So they effectively have a monopoly. I would note that in the 1990s, the US controlled most of this global market. And the fact that the Chinese have a monopoly and the fact that these rare earth elements have become so critical to things like the production of motors for electric vehicles, the production of certain types of consumer electronics. Now that we're entering into the digital age, it turns out that rare earths, usually in relatively small amounts, are really critical to producing the goods that we use on a daily basis. And so when China chose to weaponize them in April of this year, after the initial big 150% tariffs the Trump administration imposed on China, we meaning the United States, U.S. industry, suddenly realized how incredibly dependent we were on China because it has a monopoly on mining and processing these. And in the case of April, the issue was the Chinese cut off the sale to the U.S. of heavy rare earth magnets, which are really critical to all sorts of things, especially the production of EV motors. And so the Chinese realized that they had this choke point technology and they weaponized it, and it was incredibly, incredibly disruptive. So the fact that we were able to elicit from China a 1 month, a 1 year reprieve, a 1 year suspension in the controls that they've put on the export of rare earth elements is a good thing. But again, all that does is take us back to February or March of this year. It's a de-escalation mechanism. We haven't really solved any problems. The U.S. hope is that in the next year, through the negotiation of agreements with other countries, most recently Australia and Japan, we can start to reduce our dependence on China. The problem is that reducing dependence on Chinese mining and processing of rare earths is really a 5 to 10 year enterprise. It's not something where it's not a problem that we're going to solve in 1 year.
But now we saw, as Donald Trump was approaching this meeting, this summit with Xi Jinping, lots of bilateral deals, U.S. and Australia, many other countries. Is he now beginning to understand, from your perspective, how important it is to have allies and friends and deals in the region, really, trying to make up for lost ground after the collapse of TPP?
Unfortunately not. What he's been doing is negotiating a series of bilateral deals that involve tariff reduction on the U.S. part in order to elicit greater American access to local markets, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, et cetera, and elicit commitments from countries to invest more in the United States, like the recent deal with South Korea, in which South Korea pledged over time to invest a total of 350 billion in the United States. That is very different than TPP. TPP was not a series of bilateral agreements. TPP was designed originally to be an agreement among 11 or 12 economies, including the United States, in which everybody signs up to follow the same set of rules about in trade, investment, digital commerce, etc. So the whole idea is that you sort of create common rules that everybody agrees to and put peer pressure on outliers like China to abandon bad trade policies and adopt better ones. But of course, Trump in his first term withdrew from TPP. The Asian leaders went forward with TPP anyway, and now we're just cutting a series of bilateral deals that are largely focused on tariff relief for tariff relief. So this is sort of it's almost like we're going back to the pre-WTO days in a way.
So I want our audience to understand from a perspective, if you were the leader or citizen of one of these ASEAN countries like Thailand or Malaysia, Vietnam, et cetera, do they look at China as an unstable and unsteady partner, or do they look at the United States as an unstable and steady partner? How do they, from their perspective, how do you think they're processing this moment?
Well, this is an incredibly, incredibly difficult moment for most countries in Asia. So if you're an American ally, so that would be Japan, Korea, Australia, you need the United States for your security. So what you're focused on is the uncertainty and the volatility in your relationship with China. But in Southeast Asia, if you're Malaysia, if you're Vietnam, you're not a treaty ally of the United States. You don't want to choose between the United States and China. But in trying to figure out where that space is between those various options, America is looking more uncertain, more unreliable, and to some economies, actually a source of active disruption of the global trading system. And of course, America is imposing tariffs on you. And so what that does is the Chinese see that as creating a very permissive opportunity for them to grow their economic ties, their political ties, and possibly eventually their security ties. So it undermines America's ability to compete with China within Asia, because the U.S. no longer looks like a stable, reliable security partner and economic partner. We know that nobody wants to choose between the United States and China. But what we do want them is to, over time, orient themselves more toward the United States as both a security partner and an economic partner. In other words, lean toward the United States in their geopolitical decisions. And Donald Trump is making that incredibly, incredibly difficult to do.
But if you're in circles in Washington, D.C., I'm going to tell people what is still whispered about were apparently leaked assessments at some point that somehow China was going to move on Taiwan in 2027. Do you think China is looking at this moment of a lot of confusion in the U.S., erraticism in the U.S., maybe assessing that this is a soft moment, that maybe it makes sense to move because of what it's seeing as the softness or inchoateness of the United States in Asia?
I think that right now, Xi Jinping still looks at the Taiwan question as a problem to be managed, not as an opportunity to be seized. China's policy is essentially to deter Taiwan moves to independence and to try and create economic and political incentives for Taiwan, the people of Taiwan, to see their future more tied to the mainland. And an important part of this is very active information strategies to undermine the confidence of the people of Taiwan in American commitments to Taiwan. And the problem is Donald Trump gives Xi Jinping lots of opportunities to undermine that confidence of the Taiwan people in the United States. Because the other thing that's whispered about in Washington circles is that during the Trump term, there were multiple conversations between Xi Jinping and Trump, where Trump conveyed effectively an ambivalence about Taiwan, that China is much more important to the United States than Taiwan, and that it was not really clear that Trump was going to be, willing to continue substantial military cooperation with Taiwan, for example. And so actually three big decisions that the Trump administration has already made is suspending an arms sale in the last 6 months, suspending the transit of the Taiwan president through the United States on a trip to Latin America. And number three is suspending a very high level defense dialogue, making it much lower level, sort of mid level, and pushing it from the Washington area to California. So it's clear that the Trump administration is not prioritizing the Taiwan issue. And the concern among many scholars, analysts, policymakers is that the Chinese sort of sniff out an opportunity here to leverage Trump's ambivalence as a way to further undermine Taiwan's confidence and perhaps even get Trump to shift U.S. policy. Steve, as you know, U.S. policy to Taiwan has a very sort of biblical, Talmudic quality to it. Every word is very carefully chosen. Each word is pregnant with meaning. And there's been a lot of debate there's debate within China and a lot of discussion between Americans and Chinese about whether or not Xi Jinping over time is going to sort of push President Trump to modify U.S. policy on Taiwan, shift some of the language. And while the changes in the particular terms on face value don't look that meaningful, shifting from do not support Taiwan independence to oppose Taiwan independence, the danger is that the shift in that language has outsized strategic significance to the people of Taiwan. It would signal a diminution in the U.S. commitment, which could really change the dynamic, which is exactly what Beijing wants. And so going back to our discussion about going back to our discussion of the summit between Trump and Xi, both sides said that the Taiwan issue was not discussed. But what worries me is that this summit has put both sides on this pathway to Trump's visit to China next year and then Xi Jinping's reciprocal visit. And the Chinese will use this sequence, this sort of, commercially driven détente in U.S.-China relations to elicit some kind of shift in U.S. policy toward Taiwan.
Another thing I think I've lost the number of fingers on my hand that I can count the number of times we've had, the importance of a pivot to Asia. And every time you have
Steve, 10 fingers.
Yeah, 10 fingers, but you pivot to Asia almost as a market signal for a distraction in Europe, Ukraine, Russia, Middle East over and over and over again, that the efforts of the United States to continually focus on Asia, which was tried under Obama, Biden, others, even in this administration, seems to being pulled back by other realities elsewhere in the world. How do you see that tension between America's footprint and commitments elsewhere, the way it's easily distracted from what it keeps saying its primary intent is to be deeply, deeply engaged in Asia, but it doesn't seem to be able to pull it off?
Well, I think the first and most important point to realize is the baseline. It's not as if the U.S. is not involved in Asia and we're trying to pivot to Asia. I mean, the United States is very, very deeply involved in the Asia Pacific and it has been that way for 80 years. I mean, America has 5 treaty allies in the Asia Pacific. America has 28,000 forces deployed in Korea, somewhere between 40 and 50,000 forces deployed in Japan, and well over 100,000 at Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. So America is deeply, deeply involved. The question is how to incrementally, over time, increase U.S. involvement in Asia. That was the whole purpose of the pivot, was to recognize that American strategic interests were growing and to increase U.S. involvement.
You knew the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to President Carter. I did too. And he would, write and say, basically, we already have a G2 world, that China and the United States are the only powers that can do anything in the world. They get together, they matter. So we have a G2 world. Others say we have a G0 world. No one's in charge anymore. It's a headless world. I'd be interested, to get your take. Is the China-U.S. relationship, as tempestuous as it is, essentially a de facto G2?
No, I don't think it is. I think we're transitioning from a unipolar world in which the United States was dominant to a world in which power is much more diffuse. So I certainly don't think it's G0. I don't even know what that term means because will always be poles in the world. I think we're transitioning from a unipolar system to a multipolar system, but that transition is not happening abruptly. Usually these transitions in the history of international relations take place because of big events, a global depression, a war, and so the shift occurs very rapidly and it's very clear. That's not the case now. And so what we're seeing is economic military power become more diffuse, but it's a multipolar world in which the United States is still very dominant and, importantly, a strategic reference point. What concerns me about some of Trump's policies is it feels like he's trying to accelerate the transition from the unipolar world to a multipolar world. And what's important to me is if we can, if we actually end up in a multipolar world, that the United States remain a key reference point. Of course, China's influence is growing, but the reality is there are long-term structural weaknesses in the Chinese economy. Its currency, to make a very obvious point, is not freely convertible. China's capital account is largely closed, so it's not like anybody really wants to hold renminbi for any other purpose than trading with China. And of course, China doesn't have a global military capability. And the more China builds up its military in Asia, the more it freaks out all of its neighbors who will increasingly be looking to the United States and others. So to me, the framework for thinking about global order that I think is very useful comes from a very famous political scientist at Princeton University, John Eikenberry, where he says the world is really evolving into a groupings of three: the global West, the United States, its allies in Asia and in Europe, the global East, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and like-minded folks, and then this huge group, the global South. And so to me, that sort of tripartite structure really captures where the world is today. These are not independent poles, but these are groupings of countries that share similar values, similar interests, and similar outlooks. And what we're going to see is a lot of sort of jockeying for position in this world where you have these three groupings that are defined by very different sets of values and interests.
Well, really terrific discussion. We'll have to leave it there. Really appreciate your candor and your insights. Georgetown University professor and former White House advisor on China, Evan Medeiros, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? China is just too big for the United States to wall itself off from. They are joined at the hip with a huge amount of bilateral trade, and they are rivals for power on the global stage, with two leaders who just will never trust each other and who will never give up trying to outdo the other. Both realize they can't really divide the world into competing camps, but that doesn't mean that tensions are magically going to disappear. An ongoing hybrid kind of struggle, testing each other constantly, is likely the best and even the safest outcome between China and the United States. The funny thing is that in the midst of all this, the U.S. is sort of flirting with abandoning the global stage, leaving China to dominate it if it wants to. All Beijing has to do now is to follow Napoleon's advice. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. And that's the bottom line.